Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. After a little while, we've got back Miss Maria Beat, who's going to tell us what's the what's the big dish cooking up between the Russians and the Chinese when Xi Jinping visits Moscow and meets President Putin. There's a discussion of the peace plan. There's a discussion of various other things. Let's get a little bit of an insight as to what this all means and how will this war go forward. Maria, thank you so much once again for joining us. It's always an honor and a pleasure listening to you.
Well, very nice talking to you today, Audi, in particular on the day when President Xi has just left Moscow and he's on the way back home. Well, I won't be exaggerating to say that it was a kind of event to have happened that been the focus of international attention everywhere. Of course, opinions or assessments of the meeting vary, which is normal. But it's something of great importance for Russia and China because both of the leaders they clearly expressed their desire to proceed with fruitful and in-depth cooperation in different sectors. And of course, they discussed the Ukrainian settlement topic based on the so-called 12-point proposal offered by China a month ago. So it's a major event to have happened in the recent time, and I think we will have it as the focus of international discussion for quite a while.
Indeed, that's the main thing. I mean, both these leaders have met up. Let's begin with the symbolism of this meeting. Just the factor that these two guys sit down and talk. They're probably playing a game of bridge, for all I know, inside. But the symbolism is pretty big. It is actually rattled a lot of people around the world because of the factor that there was news that the Chinese are planning to send some weapons to Russia, and so there's this whole rhetoric which is actually on at the back end. Before we get into the deep meaning of this meeting and stuff like that and what was discussed, uh, what is the symbolism of both of them meeting at Moscow?
First of all, it's been their second meeting in a decade. The previous meeting happened exactly 10 years ago. This is one thing. And another thing is that it's their first meeting since Russians launched its hostilities in Ukraine. Of course, contact between the leaders were quite intense during the past period since February 2022, but at least China was voicing its neutrality all the time. And during this past 3 days meeting, for the first time, it was voiced by President Xi that Russia is a great friend and Putin is his dear friend. By this, he rendered full support to what Putin and Russia are doing. This is, of course, of great political meaning, not of any kind of physical, so you call it support. In regard to the Chinese weapons delivery, well, it's been a lot of saying these days, and China was quite clear with saying no, there are no Chinese weapon deliveries to Russia. But we all know that black market in arms trading is huge. There could be some behind the scenes deliveries because Chinese drones are found fighting in Ukraine as well. So there could be some military corporations sending weapons to both Russia and Ukraine in a paramilitary way from China, and it's not necessarily the Chinese corporations. So the symbolic content would be that the leaders met face to face for the first time since the Russian so called special operation started in Ukraine.
That's a very uh, interesting thing, because when we look at the start of the operation as well, they had announced a no limits partnership. Now, one thing that the West actually fears is a Russia China alliance. Uh, the there's a difference between a partnership and an alliance. I think we all know that. An alliance would be a legal binding to come to the aid of the other in case of a issue somewhere. When you talk about an alliance, it is, when I look at it, it is one of the most impossible things, if I may actually go that far, between Russia and China because of their own diverging interests. I mean, let's take India for that example. The Chinese have problems with us, and the Russians don't, and the Russians have great cooperations with us. This is the story pretty much everywhere, because the Chinese have issues with Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia. The Russians have very good relations with all of them. So there is a dichotomy of, you know, interests of both the countries. How do you look at the Western push or the Western narrative of an alliance between Russia and China? Is it even possible?
I see your point, and I've been thinking about it myself for quite a while. If we look at specifics of interstate relations between Russia and other countries these days, then we could say that Russia is rather after so-called strategic cooperation, but not after building alliances, as it used to do in the old days of the Soviet Union. For instance, if we look at Russia Turkey relations in Syria, well, they still have a lot of disagreements. And in the past, they even had military conflicts in Syria, but still the cooperation goes on. So I think that Russia would proceed in a similar way with China. It says in the open nowadays that there is no alliance, but we have strategic cooperation because, of course, there are certain so-called thorny issues. And of course, Russia is after building relations with certain countries that are not on the very good terms with China. And India is one of the examples. Russia is fully aware of all the tensions you have with China, but still it is strongly after building economic, in particular, cooperation with India. China is of large economic importance nowadays for Russia. So Russia would, I think, easily close the eyes to certain political issues existing between China and other countries in order to promote its economic advantages with China. Look, if we could focus on what kind of agreements were signed during the past visit. The first in line would be the gas pipelines construction, because Russia now, since it doesn't have access to the European markets. Now it's strongly after building pipelines to take its natural gas to Asia, in particular to Asia Pacific region. The first pipeline is working with increasing speed between Russia and China, the power of Siberia. It has doubled its delivery volume this year, and in January, the intergovernmental memorandum was signed between Russia and China on building the so-called Far Eastern pipeline that would be taking gas from Russian Sakhalin to China. And during the past 2 days, they discussed and detailized the Siberia, the power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which is due to start its construction is due to start very, very soon, and capacity would be enormous. It will be 50 billion cubic meters of gas to be pumped on the yearly basis, and it will also passed through Mongolia, and all the agreements are already made with Mongolia. So this is how Russia expects its cooperation to go. So for this, it does not need to be that much focused on fully fledged alliance with China. If economic and technological, of course, cooperation proceeds the right way, Russia would be very happy, and this cooperation would be times more production for both of the countries than fully fledged alliance.
It's interesting when you say that, actually, because when you look at uh, the economic part of it, the Russians would need more than China to keep themselves alive, because of the switch over from the West, and they're trying to do that. Even in spite of India and China both buying a huge quantity of oil, the Russian economy has still actually taken the 2% dive that it did take. Uh, and when you look at it from the Chinese angle, uh, when I look at it from the Chinese angle, it also seems a little scary for the Chinese, who are not in a very great economic position, to be linked up only with Russia for their economic needs. Because if the West uses this particular alliance for hitting back at China, that's another big issue. So how do you think they plan to balance it out? Because they both can't take that step beyond just saying, okay, we are good partners, we are strategic allies, and that's just about it. Uh, how do you look at that particular front?
I respect Chinese diplomacy. It's been so sophisticated and so wise for centuries. Of course, for China is of major importance to keep working relationship with the United States and to a certain extent with Europe, because these two countries are the two entities. Uh, the United States as a country and the European Union as an international agglomeration are the major consumers of products made in China. I think there should be a kind of double layer approach to political relationship with Russia and the United West. Uh, you know that President Zelensky was quite concerned with Chairman Xi visit to Moscow, and he was voicing a kind of willingness, at least, to talk with President Xi on the phone. So I think that China, in parallel with building deep cooperation with Russia, it would continue building relationship with Ukraine. That's why now it positions itself as a major contributor to potential peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, it's a demanding task for the Chinese diplomacy to preserve this kind of sophisticated and I would say fragile relationship with the world because it has to be on good terms with two and strongly opposing each other parts of the modern world. Russia on one hand and the United States and United West on the other.
That's a big problem, because at the end of it, if the Chinese were as internally strong, they could have probably taken a step or two. But I think there's quite a big challenge in that aspect as well. Uh,
Sure, of course, of
yeah,
course, it's a highly demanding task, and I personally think that presidency is a brave man to pay in person a visit to President Putin these days, when just days before that visit, Putin got a warrant from ICC. So now he is publicly recognized as a criminal and an international warrant is issued. So I think Chinese have something on their mind. Otherwise, they won't dare to go that far in building stronger relationship with Russia. And this visit is a clear sign that they're ready to build in depth and even expand their relationship with Putin's Russia.
Indeed, there is that factor is of course there because the Chinese also need the Russians at that particular front because to kind of counter the West. There is a big factor that comes out of this thing. And before we step into the peace plan, I want to also talk about the factor that none of these powers, both of them are, you know, strong powers in the world. I don't like the terminology of superpowers and stuff like that because it's a very mindset driven sort of a terminology. I'd call Taiwan a superpower as well because it's got the chip making entire chip making industry right at his doorstep. So superpower is
Yeah.
a very big thing, but these two great powers uh, wouldn't want to be subservient to anyone. Uh, Neither would the Russians want to be subservient to the Chinese, nor the Chinese would want to be subservient to the Russians. And the Chinese are have this little capability and this habit of kind of fingering around in the wrong places. Recently, they released a map showcasing Siberian cities uh, in Chinese names. And I'm sure it got noticed in Russia. They didn't really respond. But how do you look at the factor that each one of them would, at a certain point of time, would not want to cross a certain line because it'll make one or the other subservient to the other?
You know, there is a lot of talk about China being after territorial expansion and to grab certain parts of Siberia. That's why, from time to time, this kind of maps arrive. I think it's more of political nature. I don't think that China is really after that unless they make a fiduciary agreement with Russia. I don't know how strong would be the Chinese desire to go after that, but definitely Putin will never accept being subservient to anybody. And given territories of Russian Siberia, even in concession to China, it's out of question. There could be some kind of economic cooperation projects because Chinese are very sophisticated minded in terms of building different forms of international cooperation. The Belt and Road Initiative is a good example for that. Uh, so, in terms of seizing certain parts of Siberia, it's out of question. In regard how the relations proceed, of course, it all depends upon how things proceed between Russia and the West. And I think that Putin realizes strongly that he needs a strong proxy or intermediary with a really strong international position to help him making a peace settlement. Nowadays, it's not only with Ukraine, it's with the United West. And I think that China has offered this kind, maybe in a tentative way, this kind of cooperation. That's why the reception was so lavish and so poshy. It was really something extreme. I watched it all over TV online and I was deeply impressed. I haven't seen this kind of receptions at the Kremlin for many years. So it was really something special.
Of course, I'm sure. Uh, when we talk about this peace plan, I mean this plan was kind of floated as per the global security initiative of the Chinese. Post the reappointment of Xi Jinping, he keeps coming up with these initiatives to kind of impact the world. But the Global Peace Initiative talked about these 12 points, as you've spoken about, and it does not mention anything about the position and the ground holding of the Russian forces. Uh, it was initially rejected by President Zelensky, but then later on he said, I'd like to talk to President Z about it and this and that and the other. That phone call is supposed to be happening any time now, and it's really not taken place. But I'm sure they'll come around to it. There's probably a lot of back ending happening there. Uh, the West. came around and said, pointed out a glaring thing, that there is no ceasefire because then we will have to accept the Russian ground position. Now, help me understand a peace plan which has been designed by a third country, not in consultation with any of the two warring powers. Is one an imposition, two an effort to kind of resolve something. You can look at it from both the sides. Uh, I've read quite a bit of Russian opinions on it, and they are quite divided amongst themselves as well. The Russians seem to say that the Chinese are trying to, some of them say that it's a great initiative, we should welcome it, and this and that. Some of them on the other side of the line are saying that this is something that the Russians need to be careful of, because the Chinese have a lot of economic interest with the West. It should not be that we fall into a trap. How do you think the Russians are perceiving this sort of an initiative on the ground?
This so called peace plan is basically a political declaration. It's a framework agreement. It does not bear any details or any specifics.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of throwing out a flag. We want to be a party to the peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine. This is my personal understanding. But on the other hand, it gives an opening to President Putin to say, we support Chinese initiative, because he keeps saying for quite a while, we want to start talking peace with Ukraine. And Ukraine kept saying no. They even adopted a law prohibiting them to start negotiations with Russia. So now President Zelensky says, "Oh, I want to talk to President Xi," and of course, I believe if this conversation happens, he will touch upon this 12-point so-called peace settlement plan. And you never know what kind of compromise would be reached by the agreement. But one of the important things, I totally agree with you, is that this plan, be it just a framework plan, does not mention at all withdrawal of Russian troops from the Ukrainian territory, which is quite an interesting thing because this is what means the Russian interests. So, how Chinese are thinking about compromising on that, because Ukraine is just adamant that our territories should be freed. The borders as of February 2022 should be established, and sometimes they even say the borders as of 1991, apparently meaning Crimea. So this peaceful plan, it's just basic. I think something basic to give a launch to negotiations on how to make peace between Russia and Ukraine, nothing more.
That's the most interesting part of it, that and it's been spoken about like the end all where all of everything. Why do you think the Chinese want to get in the middle of this? I mean, they should be happy that the West is kind of distracted in Ukraine. The West is weakening themselves. They don't have weapons left. NATO is openly saying that we will not be able to go on a lot more. So it's an embarrassing thing for the West. Why would the Chinese want to get inside and stop a war that is currently in the Russians' favor?
Look, since recently, Chinese have been building the image on the international arena of a superpower capable to facilitate the peaceful deals between certain countries. Just recently, they were in the middle of the so called rapprochement to have happened between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So I think it's one of the major directions of Chinese foreign political activities this day. And to contribute to this so major international conflict going on as between Russia and Ukraine, and to contribute in a positive way to succeed in what they're doing would be of a great advantage for Chinese, and it would meet its desire to become a global power. So this is my understanding why they're getting in the middle of this hell of a conflict. I agree. For them, it would be much better and more comfortable just to stay aside and to watch what's going on in the world, because this is actually one of the things of Chinese diplomacy, to sit and watch what goes on. Very, very occasionally, if at all, they get involved in conflict settlement.
You know, it's tough to do conflict settlement when you have economic interests on both the sides, and that's what I'm not able to understand, because if is either for either party the deal goes south, the one loser is China. Why would they put all their, you know the Americans are actually have problems with the Chinese, and economic issues are going on. uh, if the Americans are upset about how the war actually turned out with Chinese mediation, they're going to be unhappy. If the Russians are unhappy with the way that the Chinese mediation has come out, they lose a partner. So it's like it's either, I look at it from this angle that it's an all-in approach from China. Okay, okay, let's put our chips on the table and see what happens. If we fail, we fail. We win, great enough. We become the peacemaker in the world.
But if we look at the situation from another angle, look, Americans are really after China these days, and relations between the countries continue deteriorating. Even what Blinken has said the day before, openly pushing China to obey American policies in the Russia Ukrainian conflict, like saying, be very careful, do not support the aggressor, and all these things. I don't think it's to the Chinese liking. And the more Americans press on China, I think the stronger motivation Chinese receive to build stronger their alliance with Russia, because it's just normal. If you're in a drastic situation, if you're in need of someone's shoulder, you will definitely look for this shoulder. So if American policy were more flexible, if they did not push that march on China, don't approximate Russia, don't try to help Russia in the Russia Ukrainian conflict, then maybe Chinese position would continue being neutral. So these two things happen simultaneously. On one hand, the American pressure on China, it pushes China into so-called arms of Russia. And on the other hand, the situation in the world develops in a way that Russia, well, it has a potential to win Ukrainian war. So maybe there's some kind of agreement that give a certain assurance to China that Russia will definitely win this conflict. So it wants to be on the winner's side when the conflict is over.
How do you look at Taiwan in this entire game? Is this also the Chinese preparing for their own action with Taiwan to ensure that the Russians come and say, yeah, yeah, we are with you, and Putin visits Beijing and does the entire same thing as the Chinese have been able to do during the Russia Ukraine war?
Well, Taiwan is a sunny issue, and again, the situation gets more and more tense because of American involvement. The Pelosi visit, I still can't understand why she did that, but the Pelosi visit, it has deteriorated relations between China and Ukraine on the Taiwan matter. I strongly doubt that China would apply to force or invasion into Taiwan, whatever happens. Putin is more or less neutral in regard to Taiwan. because he considers that a totally Chinese issue. But
True.
you never know how he would react if something dramatic happens.
Indeed, I think it's like a bank account both these leaders are keeping with each other. Who one guy puts one deposit, the second guy comes and puts one more deposit, and they're trying to just increase the balance for I think the days when they will need it. Anyways, moving forward, I want to talk to you about this whole peace plan itself.
Hmm.
It's interesting. I don't know what the both the leaders would have discussed on their own in their private meetings. I think they had a 4.5 hour long private meeting, which lasted till about 10:30, 11 in the night, Moscow time. President Putin has been very warm towards President Xi. The hospitality has been great. He personally came to receive, personally came to see off, and stuff like that. The public statement that was given by President Putin was, "We appreciate your efforts and your proposal. We will be sure to study it and come back to you with regards how we could think about working with you on this." That, to me, should have also been the answer from the Americans. It's a diplomatic way of saying, hold on, hang on, let us figure this out. Thank you for your this thing, but no thank you. Multiple interpretations of this particular sentence. Uh, it's not a very clear cut appreciation or an approval of the peace plan from the Russians, but they have said, yes, we are open to negotiations. How do you look at the factor that there's no open support of the Chinese peace plan, but the support of negotiations from the Russian side, which they've been saying from day one? Let's talk.
I think that the plan is not a detailed plan. It's something very general and quite vague. That's why the Russian reaction is not particular. It's again very something very general, and
General India.
Putin is being cautious because he does not know what would be inside this plan. It's I think uh, it's just a start for a very lengthy process, the process that those who are in favor of making peace settlement have been looking for quite a while. And this is what doesn't make the United West happy, because both Americans and the United Europe, they immediately said, no, 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 the time has not come yet for starting to talk on peace settlement. So apparently, they are waiting for some kind of major victories to be accomplished by Ukrainian forces on the battlefield. They want to weaken Russia more. Uh, Look, just yesterday, in the middle of the meeting, it was announced that the Brits has voiced their plans to supply Ukraine with projectiles stuffed with depleted uranium. So this is something quite alarming and of major danger, not even for Ukraine, but for many countries around. So the escalation continues after the meeting in Moscow, after Russia and China has started talking about potential peace settlement. I think it's a kind of sign to China: be very careful what you do. And I think that China would think twice what to put inside this plan. Maybe that's why very soon we may be seeing some kind of contact between President Xi and President Zelensky. Maybe certain elements of what the Ukrainians are after would be inserted in this plan, not to mention the potential conversation with President Biden, because Americans have voiced their willingness to talk to President Xi. So I think that President Putin is fully aware of these potential developments around the Chinese peace plan. That's why he's being cautious, because he does not know what direction this peace development would proceed.
The I agree. It's quite a fluid situation, and with the ground battle, uh, Bakhmut has been a turning point for both the countries. The Ukrainians have lost a lot, and this, for the first time, is coming out within the Kiev Independent, who wrote an article about the pathetic conditions of the soldiers from Ukraine in Bakhmut. They've also mentioned the factor that the average age or the average lifespan of a soldier in Bakhmut is 4 hours. And this has been written by the Kiev Independent. So I guess the reality is dawning upon Ukraine that this can't go on for a long time. I mean, they've pretty much losing whatever they had. Uh, Finally, my last question to you is about the Chinese interests within this war. We all know that China owns about 6 to 7% of Ukrainian agricultural land. A certain part of the Belt and Road initiative depended on a stable Ukraine and went through Ukraine in certain areas. Uh, the Chinese would also have an issue because all the land that the Chinese own, the Ukrainian land, is now with the Russians. So, and of course, there's a little more across Bakhmut. There's some more land that the Chinese own. It's basically in the eastern part, which is the agrarian part of Ukraine. Is this also the Chinese trying to stop the Russians and saying, okay, just stop here, let's not go forward? Uh, Not overtly saying that, but trying to put an end to this war so that their economic interests within that region are also balanced, because they're without Ukraine, without with this war going on in Ukraine, the Belt and Road is gone. I mean, the European connection of the Belt and Road is finished. So the Chinese lose trillions of dollars if this war actually goes and the way it is going right now. How do you look at the Chinese interests within Ukraine and their efforts to kind of put an end to this by trying to balance it with Russia and, of course, trying to balance it with the rest of the world?
I think that Chinese are fully aware that Ukraine as a country that it used to be before February 2022 won't exist anymore, regardless of how the war is finished. Of course, I don't know what are the agreements made between Ukraine and the United West, but I don't think that the United West renders such a huge material support for Ukraine for nothing. Apparently, there are agreements made, and most probably they are talking about the so called shared sovereignty. There could be issues. And of course, China wants to have control over Ukraine after the conflict is over. Most probably, there would be a kind of compromise reached that certain territories would remain after Russia control. And if it's the case, then for China, it's very important to have good relations with Russia in order to preserve its concession over huge Ukrainian agricultural lands. And of course, for the benefit of proceeding with the Belt and Road project, it's also important to have good relations with both Russia and Ukraine after the conflict. Because I agree with you, if China is not on good terms with both of the parties, then forget about their so called major infrastructure and logistics project passing from Asia to Europe to open the way for direct access for Chinese goods to the European markets. So a double leg game for China to play. I feel, my gut feeling is that it's a highly sophisticated game that Chinese have on their minds. It's not as simple as it may look like to us, because I agree with you. Certain things that they do raise questions, and you ask yourself, why are you doing this? Like, why are you so actively supporting, vocally supporting Russia these days? It's not the fashion of the months. It's something quite opposite to the international trend. But still, the Chinese are doing this. So this visit, it raises a lot of question marks.
It's a wonder, and that's the whole thing. I find it to be quite interesting that you've touched upon a lot of uh, realistic things, because what is being spoken about in the media is just mind-boggling. It's just like, I think, Putin and Xi have their pens on the paper for a nuclear alliance between Russia and China, and that is it. Once it's the war is started up between Russia, China on one side and the West on the other side. That's the narrative which is being spewed out. Not that I'm a China lover of any sort. I'm an Indian, so there's a lot of issues in that particular front. But having said that, it's interesting why the Chinese have decided to take this step and go there. Uh, it's a big risk for the Chinese
Yeah,
because they are vulnerable towards secondary sanctions. I wonder how the world is going to react, because the world seems a little touchy about. Uh, I'm not, the world will get a little more touchy about Ukraine when this Battle of Bakhmut comes to an end and the Russians declare victory on that particular front. It's going to be a major, major loss for the Western effort. So there's going to be a lot of propaganda and stuff like that. And the timing seems quite interesting. So thanks so much for bringing out a lot many things that have not been spoken about in media or even been written about. And that's why I like talking to people around the world, because it's easier to actually bring about a lot more things in a conversation than actually read something around. I find that a little
yeah.
more interesting. So thank you so much, Maria. As usual, you're very articulate, and you've brought about factors which we need to consider when we are studying the Russia-Ukraine war going forward. So as usual, thank you so much for joining me, and look forward to having this interaction with you once again in the future.
Thank you so much, Aadi, for saying all these nice things, and I appreciate very much our conversation. And I'm deeply impressed with all the questions you've asked me, because I respect your deep interest in what goes on between Russia and other countries. And thank you so much for your attention to these matters. Have a very good day, and looking forward to talking to you very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.